Welcome, everyone. My name is Gabby Mitchell, and I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Notre Dame at Notre and the Jerusalem Global Gateway. I want to thank all of you for your active participation in this ongoing global dialogue discussion on the worsening water crisis. In the past sessions, we've traveled to Nairobi and Malawi, the west coast of Ireland, the city of Mumbai, Mexico City, London, and Santiago, Chile, to discuss topics surrounding the issue of water in the 21st century. And it's our endeavor to continue these important conversations, discussing the worsening global water crisis by building a virtual community and connecting with all of you as a global audience to reflect upon the material presented. We hope that your experience in this series continues to be insightful and engaging, and that you are connecting not only with us here at ThinkND, but also to the global community engaged in this series. The continued support of this global dialogue series has received from Notre Dame International, the Office of the President, the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and the various colleges and units on campus, has been a mark of the university's commitment to being a leader in discussion about the pressing global needs of humanity. This week, I'm excited to be with you and have the opportunity to discuss water diplomacy between Israel and Jordan, including the construction of a major solar power plant in the Hashemite Kingdom and a desalination plant in Israel. It is ironic, I have to say, that this week, even though I'm based usually in Jerusalem, this is the first opportunity that I've had to come and visit South Bend. And while Jerusalem is a place where we oftentimes are asking and even praying for water, it doesn't seem like in South Bend, Indiana, anybody needs to pray for water. It has literally rained almost every day that I've been here this past week, and it has been fantastic. On November 22nd, 2021, the governments of Israel and Jordan signed their largest ever cooperation agreement, which will see the construction of a major solar power plant in the Hashemite Kingdom to generate electricity for Israel, while a desalination plant established in Israel will deliver water to Jordan. This memorandum of understanding, facilitated by both the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and the United States, marked a significant moment for two neighbors who share a long history of conflict and cooperation on matters pertaining to water security. It also demonstrated the possibility of exchanging environmentally friendly natural resources, in this case, water and solar energy, as a way of increasing regional stability and supporting green policies. This agreement took place during a period of unprecedented climate change in the region. Scientists are in agreement that the Mediterranean is a climate change hotspot, where both changes in the dynamics of upper atmosphere circulation and a reduction in the temperature difference between land and sea are drying out the region and reducing annual precipitation in the process. According to the 2021 United Nations report, the Mediterranean region, which includes Israel and Jordan, will experience a 20% temperature increase in comparison to other parts of the world. And with that, heat waves, water shortages, forest fires like those that took place in Greece and Turkey last summer, and a loss of biodiversity. In other words, climate change, while a global phenomenon, is happening more rapidly in specific parts of the world, including the Mediterranean. And in essence, the Mediterranean is a foreshadowing of what could happen in the future if we don't find the appropriate sets of international and local policies to address climate change. This is particularly important in the Levant, where Israel and Jordan are both located. Due to the geography of the area, Israel receives approximately double the amount of annual rainfall compared to Jordan. However, both countries must wrestle with the challenges of a summer season lasting roughly from May to October, where there's little to no rainfall whatsoever. Historically, water rationing has been common in both countries. As temperatures look poised to increase, the pressure is mounting on local and national governments to find solutions that will provide their citizens with the water security necessary to have a functioning economy and basic social needs. And now, with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Dr. Daniel Blumenthal to talk to us about our topic for today, understanding water diplomacy between Israel and Jordan. Dr. Daniel Blumenthal is the Department of Energy Attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, where he represents the full range of DOE's energy, cyber, science, and nuclear security portfolios. Prior to his arrival in October 2020, he managed radiological response programs at DOE headquarters. In that role, he led the initial DOE response team to Japan following the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident in March of 2021. He has also participated in many international technical exchanges regarding emergency preparedness and nonproliferation. Prior to working at DOE, he spent time at the Department of Homeland Security's Domestic Nuclear Detection Office as chief test scientist and at the DOE's Remote Sensing Laboratory as a senior scientist. Dr. Blumenthal's background is in nuclear physics and health physics. Now, as you may know, those of you who have participated in the Think and D series over the course of the last few months, when we promoted this event, we shared a pre-recorded video that was posted on our website where Dr. Daniel Blumenthal and I discussed a few of the themes that we're going to touch upon today. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch them, I recommend you go to ThinkND and check it out. Dr. Blumenthal, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
We're going to start off our conversation today with a few introductory questions, but we also encourage questions from our audience and ask that if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. We'll try and answer as many of them as possible, given the existing time constraints that we have today. Just to start off, Dan, I was curious whether you could talk to us briefly about the technologies behind this agreement. You know, I use terms like desalination, solar technology. Can you explain to us what is desalination and how does it work?
Sure. So it's basically a mechanical process that takes seawater from, in Israel, the Mediterranean, and forces that water through these high-tech membranes with very small pores and at high pressure. So it's a process that's very energy intensive, coincidentally. So there's that energy water nexus. It takes energy to make water in Israel. But you take the water, force it through the membrane, and the process is called reverse osmosis. And the desalinated, or the water, comes out one side of the membrane and leaves the more saline water behind. And these plants, if you've ever been to one, have you seen one, Gabby, in Israel? They're
Yes,
huge, and
yeah.
It's a very stepwise process. So each membrane it goes through takes a little bit of the salt out, and it goes through many steps. And like one plant may have 20,000 of these membranes. So what comes out the drinking water end is drinking water, and then the what's called brackish water, very high, saline content is kind of like the waste. So you have really pure drinking water. Actually, it's so pure that they have to add some minerals back to it to make it legal to be drinking water because it's so pure and so clean.
Wow, that's really interesting. How many desalination plants exist in Israel, and is this technology available and used widely across the world?
Yeah, let's see. There's a few online right now in Israel, and Israel gets, I think, about 70 or 80% of its water from these plants right now, as compared to the aquifer. And there are two more that are under construction that will be online in the next 2 to 3 years, because Israel's undergoing growth of about 2% a year. And so that means growth in water consumption, growth in electricity consumption. So they need those plants to both cover the growth in the population, as well as reduce their reliance on the aquifer. Because as you talked about droughts, Israel suffered a multi-year drought some time ago, and that drove them to decide that they should get more of their water from the desalination process, so they'd be more resilient against droughts in the future.
Yeah, I remember the first time that I visited Jerusalem. It was during the summer months, and in essence, they had rations for how long one should take a shower, right? And how much public water could be used for various purposes. It was something like, don't take more than a 5-minute shower, which is probably probably familiar to anyone who has been to parts of the world that are extremely arid and have a low water supply. But since then, in the many, many years since the first time I visited Jerusalem, those restrictions have disappeared, right? And so that is, as you've explained, in large part due to the technological advancement and the capacity of desalinating water, essentially extracting the salt from seawater, which is incredibly impressive. Out of curiosity, when we talk about the agreement that was signed between Israel and Jordan, Israel will supply, at least in accordance with the agreement, desalinated water to Jordan, but Jordan is going to supply solar power to Israel. Talk to us about kind of, solar power technology today, and how it is envisaged in the particulars of the space that we're talking about, the Levant region, like Jordan. What do we mean when we talk about solar power? How does it work?
Okay, there's different kinds of solar power. Like solar can just use the heat from the sun to heat water for hot showers. But what we're talking about here is solar energy that is directly converted into electricity. So there's what are called photovoltaic cells, solar cells. So the sunlight hits them, and then they generate electricity, and that is and each panel generates a small amount of electricity. So to generate the amount of electricity in the agreement, which was about 600 megawatts, and just to put that in perspective, that's about 1% of Israel's projected electricity needs in 2030, and about 4% of what they want to produce from solar electricity. So these solar cells will generate that amount, and takes about, for that amount, it would cover about 2,500 acres of land. So you have these solar cells, and they're all wired up together, and they feed the transmission lines that would go from Jordan into Israel and then connect to the Israeli electrical grid.
So we're not only talking about the construction of a solar field. You described 25 acres, correct?
2,500 acres.
2,500, excuse me, 2,500 acres in order to soak up the sun's energy and turn that into electricity. But also there's an essential component of this, which is developing the infrastructure to transfer that electricity from Jordan to Israel, and of course vice versa. You need the pipelines to deliver desalinated water, I assume, from Israel to Jordan, or will the water be delivered in some other way?
Well, first, on the electricity side, one important point about renewable energy is, especially solar, it's only produced when the sun is shining. So you build the capacity of these photovoltaic panels to generate more, so you could potentially store it up during the day. And that means that the wires, the transmission grid, has to be more robust than if you were just generating electricity steady state 24 hours a day. So that's one reason that when people talk about and whether it can handle renewable energy, that's the challenge, because at any moment in time, there might be more electricity trying to flow through the grid than if it were just steady state, natural gas fired power plants that run 24 hours a day. That's why enhancing the grid is so important here on the electricity side.
I know that this is a little off topic. I want to get back to how the water will be transferred, but you mentioned electricity storage or solar energy or renewable storage. Where do we stand in terms of the technology to enable long-term storage, let's say in particular for solar energy?
Okay. Well, the people are probably most familiar with batteries. Some people might even have solar panels on their home, and have battery backup, and that's the most common for now. But as far as long-term and large capacity and good for the environment, there are many other options. For example, and Israel is a big innovator in this area in energy storage. There's mechanical energy storage, compressed air, thermal, and they all different forms. So let's say compressed air. You use the electricity while the sun is shining, and let's say it's a very sunny day. So you're generating more electricity than you need. And you take that electricity and use it to, in some cases, to compress air in large tanks underground where it's safe, and they just bury them under the solar fields as an example. And then at night when the sun isn't shining, you take that compressed air and use it to like run generators, turn turbines and things like that to then generate electricity the normal way with a turbine, just like in a power plant. But it's run by compressed air that was generated by the sun. Or there's other processes where thermal storage. It's all about taking the solar electricity and storing it in different forms, whether it's compressing air or heating up some material that releases the heat and runs a steam turbine, things like that. The storage is an important part of renewable energy.
Yeah, super important. So you've explained in essence how Jordan would be supplying solar energy to Israel, but how would Israel get the desalinated water to Jordan? Is it via pipeline? Is it some other form? How do you bring the water that distance?
Right. So Israel, it has what's called the national water carrier. That's their term. It's just the network of pipes and other methods of transporting the water. And fortunately for this arrangement, Israel already sells a significant amount of drinking water to Jordan. So there are existing pipelines. Think of it as a grid for the water. So instead of going through wires, it goes through pipes. Sorry, goes through pipes, and also canals, things like that. There's even talk of using the Jordan River itself, rehabilitating it so it could be a water carrier instead of in building new pipes. Just use the natural riverbed to transfer water. And now we talked about the capacity. So Israel sells between 50 and 100 million cubic meters of water to Jordan per year. That's the units they use for water are a million cubic meters. And on this arrangement between Jordan and Israel, the agreement is to sell 200 million cubic meters of water from Israel to Jordan. Just to put it in perspective, that's approximately the annual output of a desalination plant in Israel. So it would be the equivalent of selling them water from a single desalination plant. And so it can be from pipes, canals, other means. And just like they have to enhance the electrical grid to transport that much water, doubling the amount of water they sell to Jordan, they have to increase the capacity of the national water carrier, which they are already doing for their own needs. As I said, Israel's growing at a great rate, so they need more capacity to move the water around for their own needs.
So I'm curious, right? In the history of relations between Israel and Jordan, there were certainly periods in the past in which the two countries were at conflict with one another over water resources, whether it be along the Jordan River or some of the water sources that spill into the Jordan. So can you explain just a little bit about the reasons why these countries are choosing to cooperate on these projects? And at a technical level, what's to stop Israel from producing its own solar energy, which, I know that Israel has solar energy fields. So why not just build more solar energy fields? Or what's to stop Jordan to, build its own desalination plants? Why are these two countries seeking to, essentially trade resources rather than just going it alone?
Right. Well, and we can talk about that more later, but I think it's relates to the whole idea of the global climate crisis, and no one can really tackle it effectively on their own. But as far as the solar and Israel, it was surprising to me when I moved here that Israel doesn't have enough open and unaccounted for land to put enough solar panels out to generate the amount of solar electricity it needs. So it's spoken for, whether it's for agriculture, natural reserves, military uses in the desert. So they actually don't have enough land. And Jordan has enough land and even more sunny days than Israel does. Just like you talked about rain, Israel has more rain than Jordan. So Israel doesn't have the land, and Jordan has the land and the sun. As far as so that's why it's a win for Israel to buy the solar electricity from Jordan. As far as the water, Israel has the desalination technology and a lot of the capacity, just because they're building themselves to be so, secure in terms of water security. So it's easier for Jordan to buy its water from Israel, which already has the technology and the infrastructure to do that. The desalination of water is a much more complicated and time-consuming process to get up to speed in than to produce solar electricity.
Thank you.
So it's a good order.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a logical exchange. And as you had referenced earlier, this isn't the first time that these actors are cooperating on water-related issues, even though they have a history also of conflict. And this is obviously the agreement is a stepping up and a gearing up of that kind of relationship.
And you mentioned the climate and like why now, right? Because of the climate crisis. You said it's worsening in the Mideast, and there's both the climate crisis, and so Israel and Jordan both have goals to help meet that climate crisis. Israel wants to produce a much larger percentage of its electricity from renewables, which in Israel means solar electricity. So that kind of help, and water is becoming even more scarce in Jordan. So that kind of is the why now.
I have to assume that, if these solar fields are being constructed in Jordan, that Jordan will also benefit in, from solar energy and solar energy produced electricity.
Well, the fields that they're building for this particular project won't be connected to the Jordanian grid. They'll be used to supply the Israeli electrical grid.
Okay.
But they can benefit by, they'll develop and have to maintain the technology, which would require, a relatively high-tech workforce.
Right. So it's essentially a job generator, but for both parties, right? Yeah. How does this arrangement impact the average Jordanian or Israeli citizen? You spoke about the quantities of electricity and the quantities of water and how they matched up with the national numbers, but is the average Jordanian or Israeli going to feel this in a direct way?
We'll start with the water. I mentioned that first. I think that'll be the more tangible thing in electricity, because you can see and you can touch water. You can't see and touch electricity. Your light bulb goes on, then there's electricity. But for water, Jordan is in a perpetual water shortage right now. I think supply is only about 75% of the demand. And according to the United Nations, so any country with the average water supply of less than 500 cubic meters per person faces what they call absolute scarcity. And in Jordan, instead of 500 per person, they have 150. So the residents definitely feel it. And for example, in Amman, a lot of residents are in a place where the water from the municipality is turned on 1 day a week. And so people fill up their tanks and cisterns or whatever they have, and the water that they collect that day has to last them the whole week. And if they run out, then they would have to buy water from a truck and pay as much as 10 times the normal municipal price. So the water is very tangible, and I think that'll be a real effect. On the electricity side, I said it's less tangible, but there'll be more electricity. It'll be very competitive rates. It probably will be around the same rate or maybe even less what people are paying now. And it will increase the share greatly of how much Israel gets from solar electricity.
Right. I know that U.S. climate change envoy John Kerry was present at the signing ceremony in November, alongside Israeli and Jordanian ministers of energy and the UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. Can you talk about why this agreement was important from an American perspective?
Sure. As John Kerry has said, and others, there's no greater challenge that we're all facing right now on our planet than the climate crisis. And no country can solve it alone. And that's how we talk about this agreement. It's sort of a win-win for both sides. So we all need to work together in the region here, as well as across the globe. And that's why the U.S. is so invested in this. And this Project Prosperity, is a great example of such a partnership. And transforming the global energy sector is essential to limit the temperature rise and the global climate crisis that you talked about and meet what we all agreed under the Paris Agreement. And it requires to develop and deploy a full range of clean energy technologies to reach those net zero emissions by mid-century, and to drive down the cost of new technologies and turbocharge the green energy revolution. The U.S. and led by DOE is doing a lot of what we call earth shots, harkening back to the old moonshot era where you dedicate a lot of resources quickly to accomplish something. So DOE is doing these earth shots in energy storage to make it last longer, be cheaper, and have more capacity, doing the same in hydrogen to make that an alternative, doing the same thing in carbon capture to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's some of the things that we're doing. And historically, you talked about, so the U.S., historically, the U.S. has been the engine of global energy innovation. And it's vital that we revitalize American leadership in the growing global market for renewable energy.
Right. The more that the United States kind of, paves the way for the transition from the fossil fuel era to the renewable era, the more likely it will encourage similar investments across the globe, in essence. I'm curious, the signing of the agreement was in November. And as we know, these kinds of large scale projects oftentimes take a long time to essentially get realized, right? So what steps at this point need to be taken in order to kind of get things off the ground? And what's the anticipated timetable, right? You had mentioned that there's some existing infrastructure delivering water from Israel to Jordan, but certainly the solar fields are not constructed. So when will there be a realization of this anticipated bilateral agreement?
Yeah, so see, on the electricity side, that's more straightforward. Like I said, it's just putting out solar panels and connecting to the grid. Like, sounds really simple, but well, they have to pick a site in Jordan where they can put out, a few thousand acres of solar panels. And I think that site survey work is actually ongoing already. They have to decide where should the transmission lines cross the border and connect into the Israeli grid. And there's discussions about that already. And then making it so it has enough capacity, because like I said in the agreement, they said, okay, we'll produce at least 600 megawatts, but they could do more, and you don't want to build your grid for what's in the agreement and then not be able to put out more solar panels. So citing where it would cross the border, those are the kind of things that they can do now. And then putting out the panels. So if everything went smoothly, they'd probably be able to be producing and transmitting electricity in a couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years. On the water side, if one has to build more desalination plant, that's a much longer process. It could be from permitting to construction and all that could be 5 or more years. So getting more water now would rely on, just using existing infrastructure or those desalination plants I mentioned that are coming online in a couple of years to increase the capacity of what goes from Israel to Jordan.
So, I mean, this agreement is in some ways unique, but you do see similar types of initiatives taking place all over the world, the exchange of natural resources, electricity for water, and others. And it seems like, this drive to both combat climate change, but also to set aside maybe political differences for the sake of common goals and interests and providing basic needs for local populations is in some ways driving this. But right. It also just sounds like the tip of the iceberg in terms of engaging in climate change issues, in particular in the area of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Are there other initiatives or types of projects that the U.S. is either supporting in a diplomatic sense or encouraging through through U.S. diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned more global, and the electricity from Israel and Jordan is relatively simple. They're nearest neighbors. Another initiative that has been discussed in the region is interconnection on a much bigger scale, having an undersea electrical cable connecting Israel through Cyprus onto the European grid. So there, talk about energy security and resilience, because you'd be able to share electricity much more broadly. So when if it's based on renewable energy, that's even better, because then while the sun is shining here and there's no sun or wind in Europe, then the electricity goes one way. If it's no sun shining here, then you have, whether it's sun or wind power in Europe, goes this way. So that's electrical interconnection in a big way. And having it as an undersea cable versus, there's also been talk of pipelines, means that it's agnostic to what produces the electricity. If you produce it via wind or solar or natural gas, you're sharing the electricity however you produce it.
And I think that just to piggyback off of what you said, the challenge, as you described it earlier about renewables, is that the technology for storage hasn't quite reached the levels in which would maybe be desirable, and so the selling of excess electricity both enables the sharing of electricity across different spaces, different countries, which is both good for the climate, right? Because you're not wasting that electricity, some of which is still being produced by fossil fuels. You're making sure that electricity is consumed. And in addition, as you had mentioned, right, it's agnostic. So it's not a zero-sum game the way that we oftentimes tend to view natural resources. When you focus on the electricity, it can, or it has the potential to be win-win, provided that the infrastructure exists in order to share that electricity to all communities within a given society or across borders. I know that we are reaching the point of our conversation in which we should transition to questions from our audience. I have a number of questions for you, and I'm going to read them off just in succession, so that everybody can hear questions coming in from, I assume, all over the world. The first question is this: how is the Brackish salty water produced in the desalination process disposed of? Is it just dumped back into the Mediterranean? And are there any environmental concerns about doing that? Or, explain to us what happens with the brackish water. Well, what do we do with it?
That's a good question. And yeah, there has been discussion if you have, if you line the entire Mediterranean coast with desalination plants, at what point do you generate so much brackish water that it would, impact the environment, whether it's putting it back, change the sea or harm the terrestrial environment. And I mean, from what I've heard, they're not even close to that. As far as what they do with the brackish water, I'm not sure. I mean, I know they certainly can use the salt, but I'm not sure on a large scale what they do. I know they try and take the brackish water and then use it again for desalination. So that becomes sort of the feed stock for the desalination plant. And there's been research on using that versus normal seawater, because it's a lot harder to do because it's so high in salt content. But that way there's less waste, make more efficient use, and then at some point all you're left with is a pile of salt.
Right. It would be interesting to see. I also don't know the answer, whether there are companies that are looking into ways of using brackish water or the produced salt at the end of that for other purposes. But that would certainly be, oftentimes when we talk about renewable technology or, some technologies like desalination, oftentimes, we're more focused on the end product and less about all of the secondary byproducts. So it's a great question about kind of, the waste that you produce in order to create drinkable water. What do you end up doing with that? And what are the consequences? So thank you for that question. Another question for you. Usually when these kinds of agreements are made by two states, they end up contracting out the work to subsidiaries, to companies, whether international or local. So do you have any sense who's going to be producing the solar cells, the solar fields? Has that already been decided upon, or is there going to be a bidding process?
Right. So as far as the solar panels, solar fields, that's where the UAE comes in partly. There's I think the thinking is the UAE would be the ones building and operating the solar fields in like the joint venture with Jordan.
Okay. Another question coming in. If I'm correct, we in the United States have only one desalination plant. What does the outlook for desalination plants in the United States look like? And is the Department of Energy working to reduce the cost, both energy and financial, of the construction of desalination plants?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know the outlook of the U.S. in terms of, are we going to go like Israel? Are we going to go for more desalination plants? And DOE, they've had some work in our renewable energy office related to desalination, mostly R&D. So we're not involved in the strategic picture of whether the U.S. is pursuing a bigger fraction of the water from desalination. That's a good question, though.
Another question that is at least connected to the United States. I have the impression that somebody is watching or listening in from Arizona. They've written that Arizona has plenty of sun, right? Similar to the Mediterranean region, but is also dealing with water scarcity. So these types of exchanges and agreements, while we've spoken about it at the international level, could also be beneficial at maybe a local level or anywhere in the world where there are climate issues. Are there specific companies or websites that you would recommend people going to in order to understand the science, or share information about the science of solar technology, desalination technology, rather than everybody having to kind of like reinvent the wheel? Are these countries reinventing the wheel, or is this information just out there for everyone?
Yeah, no, I don't think people are reinventing the wheel. As far as websites, I mean, we could uh, look up some good ones, and I'm sure Gabby, you can share them with the audience afterwards. I know like DOE's Renewable Energy Office has a lot of information on the energy, the solar electricity side. As far as the desalination side, I'll have to look that up. But for example, Israel is very advanced in desalination technology. The membranes themselves are made in the US. So the kind of technology that's being used is global. So
Right.
it's not like people are reinventing the wheel on their own. People are sharing, the best technology available worldwide.
Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, I think that a lot of this technology is openly available, and is being shared and improved upon, right, as it's being put into process, right, as companies, both large and small, are experiencing the specifics of executing these projects, both in a small and a large scale in the field. That community of in particular scientific and technological experts are exchanging ideas and experiences with one another, and there's a host of websites and certainly conferences that maybe in a subsequent email we can distribute and share to the viewership of this Think ND series. So thank you for the question, whoever posed it. Another question that is being raised is about the relationship between Israel and Jordan. Oftentimes when two countries sign a memorandum of understanding between one another, that initial moment of cooperation essentially has a transferable power to future and other forms of bilateral cooperation. I know that it may not necessarily be in your wheelhouse, but has this agreement spun into or encouraged other forms of either energy cooperation or resource cooperation between Israel and Jordan, or cooperation between the two parties in general?
Yeah, I think that spin-off would take more time. I mean, the agreement is still very fresh, and as you said, agreements like this, take time, and the parties have only met a few times at a large level. They had working group meetings, but there's still a long way to go before things are cemented enough that they can start thinking about spin-offs and, oh, we cooperated on water and electricity. What about, something else?
Yeah, and if I was to just kind of chime in, I think that one of the big challenges about infrastructure projects of this kind is that you want cooperation at the highest level of governments, of course, and these projects are usually not possible without cooperation at the highest level of governance. But at the same time, in terms of improving people-to-people relations or civil society relations, you want to find ways of there being a trickle-down effect from the top level agreement, in this case from the respective ministries of energy, down through the companies and through all the subsidiaries who are engaged in this endeavor to be cooperating with one another. Certainly that's the gold standard of kind of like what you're hoping for. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But this is very much the signing of the document is the first step. And there are many other steps to go until this project is completed. But hopefully the two parties will continue to maintain an engaged and cooperative dialogue with one another. And of course, with the United States and the UAE, who were supportive of this project in the first place. There's another question coming in. Is there a big push in younger generations and in universities in Israel and in Jordan to conduct research on desalination and solar energy and technology?
Well, I can't speak about Jordan, but just from what I've seen in my time here, interacting with the private sector, with the universities that are doing energy research, there's a huge push for innovation and research, whether it's basic material science to make better solar panels or better hydrogen fuel cells, and then commercializing it. I mean, I've met a lot of professors. It's amazing to me. I mean, maybe this happens in the US, I just never saw it, but it's amazing the number of professors that start their own companies and spin off technologies that then get commercialized, and some become household words. So there is definitely a push for research on solar and other renewable energy technologies. Energy storage is a huge development sector here. Desalination, the technology itself isn't advancing greatly. It's more minor refinements. And when the one desalination plant I visited, the manager of it said it's a commercial process, and so they make minor refinements just to make things more efficient and lower their costs. He said it's like tweaking a recipe, but they're not game-changing shifts in technology. Just like with energy storage, I talked about batteries, and now we use compressed air storage or thermal storage or other methods that are completely different. In desalination, there hasn't been any disruptive technologies.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all the questions that came in. We really, really appreciate it, and hope you enjoyed this conversation. I just want to summarize by thanking Dr. Blumenthal for this fascinating conversation, as well as for the important work that he is doing in Jerusalem, and for all DOE and US diplomatic representatives around the world. And thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really, really appreciate it. The next time that we meet, we will travel to the Newman Center for Faith and Reason in Dublin, Ireland, where they will discuss a new parable for the planet in Dublin. A short explainer video will be available on the ThinkND website in the coming days. Please review and come prepared to discuss on May 3rd. Also, please feel free to share this series with your friends, either via Instagram, social media, email, etc. We are accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each meeting can be a standalone opportunity to learn about water in our changing planet. Thank you once again. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and goodbye, both from Jerusalem, South Bend, and wherever you are in the world.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, everyone.